Good evening and welcome to this evening's edition of Novara Live. My name is Bastani and tonight I have the immeasurable pleasure of being joined by Mike Bankole. Mike, how are you?
Yeah, not too bad, Aaron. It's good to have the B team reunited. I feel like we've been on a bit of an absence together, but good to have you on the show and good to be on the show with you.
We had an early summer sojourn. Before tonight's show, Mike and I had a bit of a conversation about Erik ten Hag. I didn't realise he was such a football aficionado. That is for another day, however. We have so much to discuss tonight. Labour leader Keir Starmer refuses to tax the top 5%. It seems Dianne Abbott may have been stitched up in her quest to stand again as a Labour Party candidate. And the Tories have announced another new policy targeted at older voters. Stay tuned for all of that. Israel has continued its assault on Rafah with intense shelling in the centre of the city. An airstrike on a tent encampment northwest of Rafah killed at least 20, according to witnesses. 13 of them are said to be women. Located in the Al-Mawazi humanitarian zone, Palestinians who were forced out of Rafah by the IDF were promised safety here. The IDF has also been progressing its operation into the centre of Rafah. A mosque was struck in the Tal al-Sultan neighbourhood in the west of Rafah, where at least 7 Palestinians have been reported killed in the last 24 hours as Israel continues to bombard the city. Tanks have also been spotted in central Rafah, with the IDF having occupied at least 9 kilometres of the Philadelphia corridor. That is the narrow strip of land along Gaza's border with Egypt, which is supposed to remain within Egyptian control. As Israeli troops close in on the city, shelling has temporarily put the large Kuwaiti hospital out of service. And meanwhile, 3 temporary field hospitals in western Rafah have also had to close, as the IDF reportedly pressures them to relocate to Khan Yunis. Civilians continue to flee Rafah, an area that had been a designated safe zone before the IDF's operation on the city. They're also heading north to Al-Mawazi, a strip of the beach roughly the size of Heathrow Airport. And that is an area expected to house more than 1 million people who've now been displaced. The current exodus comes after an Israeli attack set fire to a tent encampment on Sunday night, killing at least 50 displaced Palestinians while they slept. Men, women, and children were burned alive in their tents, with many of those who survived scarred for life. IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari has said that the fires caused by the strikes and the casualties that occurred were, quote, a devastating incident that they did not expect. Their investigation into the fires is still ongoing, but Hagari has delivered these initial findings.
Aerial surveillance from the time of the strike, where we targeted a closed structure away from tent area. As you can see, there are no tents in the immediate vicinity of the structure that we targeted. Contrary to reports, we conducted the strike outside the area that we designated as a humanitarian area and called civilians to evacuate to. Our strike was over 1.5 kilometers away from the Al-Mawazi humanitarian area, what we call the safer zone. Here is where Hamas claims we struck, and here is where we conducted our strike against the Hamas senior commanders outside the area designated as a humanitarian area. Our aerial surveillance was filming prior to the strike in order to minimize civilian harm. Here is the footage from our strike of the specific structure where the senior Hamas commanders were meeting. The strike was conducted using 2 munitions with small warheads suited for this targeted strike. We're talking about munition with 17 kilos of explosive material. This is the smallest munition that our jets can use. Following this strike, a large fire ignited for reasons that are still being investigated. Our munition alone could not have ignited a fire of this size. I want to repeat it. Our munition alone could not have ignited a fire of this size. Our investigation seeks to determine what may have caused such a large fire to ignite. We are looking into all possibilities, including the option that weapons stored in a compound next to our target, which we did not know of, may have ignited as a result of the strike.
So let's get this straight. The IDF bombed 2 structures with small munitions, leading to a large explosion, but they don't know what caused the explosion. Surely that's a failure of intelligence which is very important when you're firing missiles into buildings with an encampment of civilians nearby. Unless, of course, you don't care about the civilians. And Hagari is very keen to point out that the humanitarian zone is 1.7 kilometers away from the structure the IDF bombed. Maybe so. But that doesn't mean there weren't civilians encamped nearby to this particular incident, outside of the safe zone. Just because civilians aren't exactly where you told them to go doesn't mean they're suddenly legitimate targets or admissible collateral damage. The Israeli government spokesperson David Mencer was asked about precisely all of this on Sky News.
There were no tents in that area. It is 1.8 kilometers away from where the safe zone in Al-Mawasi is. And that's what Daniel Hagari made crystal clear.
Right. Sorry, David, I know, I heard Daniel as well. I was listening across it at the time as you were. Who were these civilians then that were killed? Where were they? The tents caught fire, David.
This large fire which took hold, which the conversation from the Hamas operatives made clear was caused by Hamas munitions, must have caused a larger fire which affected these civilians, because the munitions which were used don't cause fires and don't cause craters. But
so the fire may have spread 1.8 kilometres, is that what you're saying, to the safe zone? Because the fire was right next to this.
This is a very, very important point, and I'm pleased you gave me the opportunity to make it clear. This was not the safe zone. This was outside the safe zone. This was 1.8 kilometres away from the safe zone. That's more than 1 mile away from the safe zone. And it was in a Hamas compound where these 2 terrorists were planning the next opportunity to kill my countrymen, to kill Jews, to kill Brits if they were there, as they did a year ago, to kill Israelis. And that's who we targeted. Of course, none of this changes. It's very important to remember, none of this changes the fact that innocent civilians have lost their lives. And that is a tragedy. But once again, it's Hamas embedding themselves into where civilians live, a Hamas compound inside where civilians are. Unfortunately, this tragic strike, it got those 2 terrorists, but sadly, ordinary Gazans have lost their lives as well.
This man, who, by the way, is formerly involved in Labour Friends of Israel, here in the UK, he's now Israeli, but apparently he used to be involved in shaping public policy in this country, because he was British, but now he's Israeli, his countrymen. Apparently, I would be his countryman not so long ago, British, but now he's Israeli. He's saying they weren't in the safe zone, so going back to what I said a few moments ago, that suddenly makes it admissible. Oh, okay, 50 people died. We saw a decapitated child, but, they weren't in the safe zone. And we killed 2 people from Hamas. So, what can you say? Going back to what Hagari said earlier on as well, we didn't show that clip, but he mentioned about intelligence showing Hamas had fired rockets from near the targeted buildings on October 7th. That doesn't make much sense, because you can't say you knew it was a Hamas missile-launched location, a hub for offensive operations against Israel, while also saying you had no knowledge of any weapons in the buildings you targeted. That doesn't make any sense. And you didn't even seem to think it was worth checking before bombing them when there were civilians nearby. I find this, just the whole thing's obviously outrageous, disgusting. My view is tens of millions of people will have seen the images that came out of there a few evenings ago. As I've said, I don't like to use this formulation, but a decapitated baby being held aloft, and they're talking about, we killed 2 people from Hamas. Even supporters of Israel, I think, would be disgusted, frankly. And I actually think there are many people right now in British politics, including MPs who abstained on a ceasefire, who saw those images and probably looked inside and said, what am I defending here? When it comes to Palestinian killings, Israel's history of investigating Israel isn't encouraging either. But Foreign Secretary David Cameron seems to have been reassured. He said this: Deeply distressing, of course, distressing, so distressing. Scenes following the airstrikes in Rafah this weekend. The IDF's investigation must be swift, comprehensive, and transparent. Meaningless words. We urgently need a deal to get hostages out and aid in, with a pause in fighting to allow work towards a long-term, sustainable ceasefire. Bullshit. Distressing. 3 UK nationals were killed by the IDF. The IDF exonerated itself in an investigation. The British Foreign Secretary did nothing. My guess is when it comes to actual Palestinians being killed, he's also going to do absolutely nothing. Washington is taking a pretty relaxed line on the bombing too, with a National Security Council spokesperson saying this. Israel has a right to go after Hamas, and we understand this strike killed 2 senior Hamas terrorists who were responsible for attacks against Israeli civilians. But as we've been clear, Israel must take every precaution possible to protect civilians. We're actively engaging the IDF and partners on the ground to assess what happened and understand that the IDF is conducting an investigation. Babies were killed, but hey, the IDF says 2 Hamas fighters were killed, so who knows if it was bad or not. That is not a calculus that is ever used, ever, quite rightly by the way, with countries perceived as hostile to the United States. Nobody says that about Russia. Okay, well, maybe the Russians killed 2 actual neo-Nazis, Ukrainian neo-Nazis. Okay, some kids were killed too, but okay, it makes sense. Nobody says that. What is more, recommending that Israel merely take precautions to protect civilians seems to represent a shift in the American stance. Less than a week ago, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said this about the White House's red lines on Rafah.
One of you asked me the last time I was standing at this podium, how are you going to judge this? And I said that there's no mathematical formula. What we're going to be looking at is whether there is a lot of death and destruction from this operation or if it is more precise and proportional.
I'd say 50 Palestinians burnt alive as they slept in tents looks like, quote, a lot of death and destruction. Maybe it's me. But fortunately, the US and UK are out of step with much of the rest of the world. Today, Ireland, Norway, and Spain formally recognized Palestinian statehood, an act that enraged Israel's Foreign Minister, Israel Katz. He said this. Khamenei, as in Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran, Sinwar, and the Deputy Prime Minister of Spain, Yolanda Diaz, call for the elimination of the State of Israel and the establishment of a Palestinian Islamic terrorist state from the river to the sea. Prime Minister Sanchez, when you don't fire your deputy, this is Yolanda Diaz, and announce the recognition of a Palestinian state, you are complicit in inciting the Jewish genocide and war crimes. By the way, that's the Israeli foreign minister, the foreign secretary. It's not some random backbencher. Those psychopathic words came from one of the most powerful people in Israeli politics. Spain's Deputy Prime Minister Yolanda Diaz did not call for the elimination of Israel or for a Jewish genocide. She said, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. And it's not just world leaders who have condemned Israel's attack on Rafah. Ordinary people have been taking to the streets too to show solidarity with Gaza. Protesters have marched through cities like New York, Paris, and Barcelona, demanding an end to the war and for Western governments to take firmer stances against Israel's war crimes. And it's precisely that mindset of stopping Israeli war crimes, whichever way you can do so, that inspired this action in Edinburgh today. Individuals from Palestine Action cut broadband cables to the Leonardo factory in the Scottish city. Leonardo is the Italian weapons manufacturer who build the targeting systems for Israel's much-vaunted F-35 fighter jets. Pretty strong message that, isn't it? If governments won't stop war crimes and a genocide continuing to unfold, well, people will take matters into their own hands. The Tories are making it very clear that their election campaign has more than an eye on older voters. We've had the nostalgia fest of the compulsory national service announcement that would see every 18-year-old do either military service or volunteer work. And now Sunak's announced a new policy, once again designed to please the older segments of the electorate. Pensioners have been promised an upgrade from the present triple lock on state pensions to what the Tories are calling triple lock plus. Elsewhere, others have used the term quadruple lock. Presumably in the 2030 elections, they'll be standing on a platform of a super-duper quintuple lock. Who knows? But what's this all about? Well, at the moment, state pensions rise each year in line with either inflation, earnings increases, or by 2.5%, whichever is more generous. Because inflation was so high last year, pensioners saw their payments increase by 8.5% in April. Now, pensions are also taxable, though many pensioners avoid paying tax because their personal income tax allowances are higher than their annual income. Say they don't earn enough from those pensions to actually have to pay any tax. But personal tax allowances have been frozen since 2021, and the Tories have promised not to raise them again until 2028. So, combine that with large increases in the state pension, and you have the result that, quite soon, a lot of pensioners will end up paying tax on their state pension. In short, what's bringing hundreds of thousands of pensioners into a threshold where they pay some tax is the triple lock and the Tory policy of freezing those personal tax allowances. On BBC Breakfast, Tory Minister Mel Stride was asked about this policy.
Pensioners would have faced paying tax on their pensions because of the freezing of tax thresholds introduced by this government.
Well, the simple fact is that this tax change, this triple lock plus, will mean going forward that millions of pensioners, 8 million pensioners in fact, will be paying less tax than they would otherwise be paying, and that is clearly a tax cut.
So
Under Labour, they're saying they're going to leave it as it is.
Introduced this tax change, correct?
Sorry, say that again, I missed it.
Your government introduced this tax change, the freezing of tax thresholds that's led us to this point. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. And that was because we went through a very difficult time, paying £400 billion to get us through the COVID challenge, and also the high inflation that came because of the war between Ukraine and Russia. But what we've been doing since is reducing taxes. So for those that are of working age, of course, we've slashed national insurance by 1/3 for employees, and that means £900 less tax being paid for those on average earnings across the country.
Pensioners don't pay national insurance, though, do they?
But on pensions, yes, exactly. Pensioners don't pay national insurance. They haven't benefited from the national insurance cut. But what they are going to benefit from is what we're announcing today, which is the triple lock plus, which means the personal allowance will go up in line with the triple lock. And that is going to mean millions of pensioners paying less tax as a consequence.
So what does the triple lock plus do? It promises that the personal income tax allowances for pensioners will also increase by either 2.5% inflation or average wage increases, whichever is higher. That means that pensioners who don't pay any tax on their state pension now never will. But it also means that wealthier pensioners will get a tidy little tax break, taking more of their income out of what's taxable. So why introduce this policy now? Torsten Bell of the Resolution Foundation has posted this handy graph. It shows the impact of all Tory tax and benefits policies announced since 2010 on pensioner incomes. Poorer households are to the left and wealthier ones to the right. The red bars show how successful the triple lock has been at keeping pensioners' incomes up. Lucky them. But the blue bars show the difference tax and national insurance changes have made. And as you can see, those have hit richest pensioners hardest, with most pensioners hardly affected by them at all. In other words, the Tories are in a panic that their tax policies have alienated classic Tory voters, namely richer pensioners. According to the Conservatives, the scheme will cost around £2.4 billion a year, and it has to be asked if that's money well spent. On the Today programme, that question was put to Paul Johnson of the Institute for Fiscal Studies.
The overall cost is about £2.5 billion a year by the end of the Parliament. That's not a very big number, but of course these promises are beginning to add up, and it's not a very big number. But again, look at Jeremy Hunt's budget and the Office of Budget Responsibility numbers, and there's very, very little headroom against the fiscal rule he set himself. I think what this is a demonstration of priorities, and the priority is to take a few more pensioners, might be a few 100,000 pensioners out of income tax relative to what we otherwise would have had.
It certainly does show the Tories' priorities. The £2.5 billion spent on the triple lock plus would keep a few 100,000 pensioners out of paying income tax. That's true. But it would also give a pretty sweet tax cut to a lot of wealthier pensioners. That's the subtext here. Whereas £2.5 billion is also the estimated cost of cutting the 2-child benefit cap, getting rid of it. A policy that would take millions of children out of poverty. Mike, is this smart politics or a laughable throw of the dice by the Tories?
I think it's a laughable throw of the dice by the Tories. I think they're at a point now where they're desperate, right? They've alienated about every other group of voters possible, whether it's young people, ethnic minorities, have never been keen on the Conservative Party, especially not now. So this is like let's try and appeal at one of our core bases and try and throw something at them. And I think it just shows that the Conservatives at the moment, I think Sunak is just bad at politics. And the Conservatives are just bad at politics, and it's a sinking ship. It's sinking very, very fast. There are very few ideas for the people in this country, and this kind of shows that. And I think there are kind of bigger problems with this when it comes to the messaging from the Conservative Party in recent weeks, right? So we heard about national service for the young and tax breaks for the rich and kind of the old here. And that's what's happening, right? The governments haven't got any ideas for the young people, the kind of future of our country. It's national service for those people. And I think when it comes to pensioners, as you mentioned, Aaron, tax breaks only help those who pay taxes. Well, actually, those who don't earn enough to pay taxes on their pensions are, a lot of them are women, right? So women who maybe are struggling at the moment. And I think I've read something that 78% of women don't earn enough to kind of pay taxes on their pensions. Those groups of pensions actually need to be supported by the government, but the governments are offering nothing for them. So it's just another desperate attempt by this government who have no ideas and don't want to address any of these systemic issues this country faces, right? As you mentioned, Aaron, the kind of decision to keep in place the 2-child benefit cap isn't one that's like, oh, we can't afford this. It's actually a strategic decision and a decision made by the government because governments don't have any interest in lifting that cap, right? So the governments are making these strategic decisions based on its ideological principles, right? These decisions aren't being forced on the government, rather the government is trying to put together kind of a policy message and a set of principles and ideas to try and win over voters. This desperate throw of the dice won't do anything. And I guess it exposes this kind of magic money tree that we always hear about, right? Because often, ultimately, governments and parties make decisions they want based on their principles and based on ideologies. And what we're seeing here from the Conservative Party is a desperate last throw of the dice from a party that have nothing left to offer.
That's so true about the magic money tree aspect here, Mike, because, it's very easy to forget this. Britain's deficit last year, that's the amount of money we're spending over what we're bringing in. We can have a conversation of whether that matters, so on and so forth. But for the Tories, for the political conversation in this country, it absolutely matters, right? It informed the entire political debate ahead of the 2010 general election. We then get austerity. It made the political weather in the 2010s. That question of deficit elimination, the Tories promised, by the way, to get rid of it by 2015 in 2010. Last year, it's £120 billion. Nobody says anything. And by the way, of course, Labour have got their sums all wrong, but forget the fact the deficit's 120 billion. Even when the deficit is that large, they're still giving tax breaks to critical voter constituencies for them. And as that graph showed from Torsten Bell, the real winners from this, are very affluent pensioners who frankly don't need it, right? They'll have income above their state pension, which is not the most generous thing in the world, the state pension, but they'll have income above that, because then they've not benefited from policies over the last 14 years. And of course, they'll benefit from having a housing asset, which is massively overinflated. They would benefit from having not paid that much for it. If they bought it in the late 70s, there was probably some inflation, which paid down their mortgage a lot. They benefited from cheap interest rates, whatnot. Go on forever and ever and ever and ever. They did very well. Out of all of it. And now we have kids who'll have to pay tuition fees. They're going to struggle to get well-paid jobs, and they'll be able to get on the housing ladder. NHS in freefall, public service is not working for them, and they're being raised in poverty, but apparently, sorry, we can't take you out of poverty because it's going to cost £2.5 billion. Let's give a tax break to a couple of 100,000 pensioners instead. And the people that will feel it the most will be the ultra-rich. Okay. Before we go to the next story, if you like what you're watching, and if you want to help us at Novara Media cover this election like nobody else, go to novaramedia.com/support. The link is in the description below. We've already amped up our coverage. We have now a newsletter, the Cortado, going out 3 days a week, not one. We, of course, have a daily show every weekday from 6 p.m. There's a lot more to come too. We are entirely funded by you, our audience, and we are intent on shifting the debate in Britain in a sensible direction. Fancy that. Nobody else in the media is going to do that. We've always said to have a different kind of politics, we need a different kind of media. Help us get there. As I say, the link is in the description below. Be a part of being a new media for different politics. From a police investigation into voting software to the party NEC imposing shortlists of one, there have been noises about dodgy selections in the Labour Party for months now. Those noises weren't subtle either. It was more like a series of loud bangs, to be honest, with words like gerrymandered and rigged used more than occasionally. And now, with a snap general election called last week, imposing politically favourable candidates into safe seats has gone into warp speed. Indeed, as many as 4 members of the Labour National Executive Committee could be selected as parliamentary candidates. A reminder, the NEC is the body that is making these decisions. A slight conflict of interest, you'd think. The Guardian reports this. A number of senior Labour figures are widely expected to seek a seat in the coming days, including Josh Simons, the director of the highly influential pro-Starmer think tank Labour Together, and Georgia Gould, the leader of Camden Council. Members of the party's ruling National Executive Committee, NEC, who have been instrumental in transforming its rules after Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, are also tipped for seats. They include Luke Akehurst, Gurinder Singh Jozan, Abdi Douali, and the NEC chair, James Assa. Now, some people don't think this is anything new. 4 members of the Labour NEC facing selection with no input from local members is totally normal. We've seen it all before. Here's what Stephen Bush from the Financial Times had to say, and a response from yours truly. Stephen Bush on Twitter from the Financial Times, fixing selections for safe seats in the Labour Party, of course, just make light of something important like rigging democracy. And then I reply to Stephen Bush, this is far beyond anything that's happened for a while. Half the Labour to win NEC slate could get seats. Strange response, and I think it is. Stephen Bush responds to that, by for a while, I can only assume you mean for 5 years, because the alternative, that there is some gradient on which no imposed elections, actually some imposed elections, is simply too silly. Even for Labour's, it's only bad when the other lot do it. Okay, lots of obfuscation there. So the inference here from Stephen Bush is that while fixing selections is bad, and it's bad, it's always happened. Blair did the same, Corbyn did the same, so you might not like it. I don't like it either, but it's not new. Regarding Corbyn, I think that's utter nonsense, by the way. After all, only one Labour candidate in all the by-elections fought between 2015 and 2019 could be described as meaningfully on the left. Of all those by-elections under the Corbyn leadership, one in Peterborough, one candidate liked the guy, but apparently he's rigging all the selections. And while certain candidates were imposed by Corbyn's office when a snap election was called in 2019, they were broadly pushed by various unions and weren't especially well-known figures. Meanwhile, what Labour is doing now, having 4 members potentially of the NEC given seats, is without precedent. You might like to bash Tony Blair, didn't happen. And any journalist who claims otherwise at the FT or anywhere else is going to lose credibility very fast. Then there's the fact that 6 Labour MPs have announced they don't intend to stand at the next election over the last 2 days, which of course means little time to run an actually democratic process. Here's a stat. In the 507 days between the 6th of September 2022 and the 25th of January 2024, just 2 Labour MPs announced they'd be standing down. 2. Could it be that other Labour MPs planning to retire were told to hold their fire so that the leader's office could parachute in favourable candidates when the time was right? It certainly looks that way. All this from a man, Keir Starmer, who had this to say way back in 2020. The selections for Labour candidates need to be more democratic, and we should end NEC impositions of candidates. Local party members should select their candidates for every election. The NEC must not impose candidates. Well, the NEC aren't just imposing candidates, Keir. The NEC are the candidates. Personally, I don't think there's any precedent for Starmer's capacity to lie and deceive at the highest levels of British politics. And yes, I'm including Boris Johnson and Tony Blair when I say that. A former Channel 4 journalist, Michael Crick, put it best. He said this: one has to ask how Labour will handle peerages and government appointments if this is how the party's national executive operates before they've even won power. So true. The Labour NEC and the right-wing faction in particular seem to be behaving like a bunch of schoolboys who've broken into the school tuck shop and are gleefully now gorging themselves sick. Look, it's quite a funny metaphor, but we're literally talking about MPs. We only get 650 of them, right? And it's notable how Keir Starmer has said, I'll always put the country before the party. Country before party. Well, if you're putting the country before the party, why on earth is Tom Watson being made an unelected legislator for life? If you're putting the country before the party, how can 4 members, like an animator I am, how can 4 members of your party's NEC get seats without any scrutiny from party members? And you might say, well, party members don't matter. Country first, remember? Well, in a 2-party system, in a safe seat, there really aren't many democratic means for accountability and scrutiny, and if you're not including party members. This seriously, for me, undermines British democracy, right? It's struggling at the best of times, right? We have an unelected second chamber, unelected head of state. When you have one of the 2 major parties, or both of them actually, behave in this manner, it's really questionable. You can have a 2-party system like the US with primaries. I think that works. I don't support it. I prefer PR. But we have first past the post like the US, but without the primaries. The worst of all worlds. Of course, if you want primaries like the US, the British media, the BBC, The Guardian, they'll call you a Stalinist. I had the pleasure of being called that up until a few years ago. In other news, a letter to the Times was signed by 120 business leaders backing Keir Starmer's Labour over the Tories. That letter reads as follows. Sir, this is to the Times of London. Sir, we as leaders and investors in British business believe it is time for a change. For too long, our economy has been beset by instability, stagnation, and a lack of long-term focus. The UK has the potential to be one of the world's strongest economies, or strongest economies in the world, rather. A lack of political stability and the absence of consistent economic strategy have held it back. The country has been denied the skills and infrastructure it needs to flourish. We're looking for a government that will partner fiscal discipline with a long-term growth strategy, working in partnership with the private sector to drive innovation and investment to build digital and physical capital and fix our skills system. This is the only way to put us on track for sustained productivity growth. Labour has shown it has changed and wants to work with business to achieve the UK's full economic potential. We should now give it the chance to change the country and lead Britain into the future. We are in urgent need of a new outlook to break free from the stagnation of the past decade, and we hope by taking this public stand we might persuade others of that need too. Where do you start with these people? We need new infrastructure. Labour will deliver it. Keir Starmer opposed HS2, right? He opposed HS2. But we need committed long-term obsession, fixation with improving our physical infrastructure. Well, maybe don't back a guy who didn't want HS2. There's an idea. Most of the people on that letter aren't household names. Indeed, some are involved in businesses which are little more than websites, frankly. But others are significant, with signatories including past and present executives from JP Morgan, Heathrow, Aston Martin, JD Sports, and Iceland. But reading that letter reminded me of this from 2015. You see, ahead of that general election, 100 business leaders wrote a letter to the Daily Telegraph expressing their support for the Tories and austerity. Yes, really. Though I suspect few of them would like to be reminded of that now. One of them was Sir Stuart Rose, who was the former top dog at M&S. He backed the Tories in 2015, who in their manifesto promised a vote on Britain leaving the EU, even though he loved the EU. So much so that in the referendum that followed, he led the Remain campaign and lost. So Rose supported, as a pro-European, the party that ultimately made Brexit happen, all in the name of stability. No chaos with Ed Miliband, please, anything but that. The point is this. Just because someone is a successful business person doesn't mean they're politically smart or have especially sensible opinions. Austerity was a disaster for a ton of businesses. It was a catastrophe for this country, not least because it meant working people had less money to spend and consumer demand was lower as a result. Yet those idiots business leaders in 2015 supported it. Indeed, over the last 15 years, big business has been wrong about basically everything. So why should we start listening now? Dianne Abbott has been under investigation by the Labour Party for comments she made last April. Until today, we thought that investigation was yet to be completed. Even Keir Starmer himself had said that there was an independent complaints process and things had to run their course. He would never intervene. And yet, a BBC Newsnight have revealed that the investigation actually finished 6 months ago, way back in December 2023. They also say that in December last year, Miss Abbott, the long-standing MP for Hackney North and Stoke Newington, and Britain's first ever black female MP, was given a formal warning over her conduct, and that in February she completed an anti-Semitism awareness course. But despite that, Abbott still has not been told whether she'll be allowed to stand as a Labour candidate in her constituency at the general election. On this story, here's what my Novara colleague Ash Sarkar had to say.
If Victoria Derbyshire's reports are accurate, what this would mean is that the Labour leadership has either significantly misled its own MPs who are out there fielding media questions about what's going on with the Dianne Abbott investigation, or, and I think this would be worse, their party to the deception. And even though they're saying that there's an ongoing disciplinary process, they know that's not true. Now, why would the Labour Party have concluded its investigation but left Dianne Abbott hanging in this position of not knowing whether or not she will stand as Labour's candidate in the general election? I can only imagine that it's where factionalism comes into conflict with what that will mean sacrificing. So the factionalism element is, of course, Keir Starmer having used any excuse to isolate, discipline, and indeed suspend the whips of left-wing MPs. We've seen that with Andy MacDonald. We've seen that with Kate Ossamore. Of course, we saw that with Jeremy Corbyn, who hasn't been let back into the party. And Dianne Abbott, I think for him, would fit very much within that strategy, particularly when you can cite anti-Semitism as a fig leaf of morality for doing something which is very underhand. Now, the cost is that with Dianne Abbott, of course, she's such a huge trailblazer when it comes to UK parliamentary politics. She's the first ever black female MP in our parliament's history. She, of course, has a huge personal mandate as a long-serving representative for Hackney North and Stoke Newington. And I think that while lots of people do view what she wrote as, perhaps unwise, failing to grapple with the nuances of racism and how racism plays out in communities who aren't just Black and Asian, people don't like it when a sincere apology isn't enough, when remorse and when contrition isn't enough, particularly when MPs like Neil Coyle, of course, who made racially disparaging comments directly to a journalist, he was allowed back into the party after a fulsome apology. So it looked an awful lot like a left-wing Black woman was being treated worse than her white, male, more right-wing colleagues. And the last thing that I'd like to say, because I know that an awful lot of people, perhaps not in our audience, but in the country more generally, will go, well, why is this important? Isn't this just a matter of, Keir Starmer is using whatever dirty tricks he has as a politician to get his own way? I expect that. The thing I would say is meaningful is that if this is how he treats members of his own parliamentary party, if he has a pattern of deception and broken promises and hiding behind processes rather than delivering perhaps difficult or controversial answers, that's not a good sign for someone who's leading a government. That makes me think that they might be equally deceptive with the public as they are members of their own parliamentary benches and indeed their party membership. Keir Starmer has a long history of behaving in this way. He called Jeremy Corbyn a friend, a close colleague, spoke at length about how much he respected him when he was running to be Labour leader. After he removed the whip from Jeremy Corbyn, it's like he couldn't use harsh enough words for him. And I think that pattern of mendacity has played out in the case of Dianne Abbott. This idea that she's a trailblazer, that she's a valued part of the Labour coalition, but at the same time treating her in a way which is completely appalling, leaving her with no clarity over her political or professional future. Now, this is an established pattern of behaviour for this Labour leadership. So far, journalists have tended to view it as a necessary evil for isolating and marginalising the troublesome left. But this man is almost nailed on to be our next prime minister. He's going to be delivering a manifesto in just a couple of weeks. Now, honesty, integrity, that is absolutely essential for someone who's going to be taking on that level of responsibility. And unless he has a huge change of heart in terms of his own personal conduct, it's likely he'll take that approach to governing.
That was Ash Sarkar there speaking to me earlier on today. Now, what the Newsnight scoop regarding Ms Abbott shows is that for months, Labour MPs have been lying to the public. Remember when it was revealed that Dianne Abbott had been the victim of racist abuse by Tory donor Frank Hester? MP after MP was asked by the media about why Abbott hadn't had the whip restored, and the answer was always the same. Oh, I can't possibly comment. Ongoing investigation. Process, investigation. Can't comment, except it was all rubbish. But even now that we know the party's internal investigation concluded months ago, some Labour MPs still, even now, can't give a straight answer. This was Shadow Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds on the Today programme.
Are the people of Hackney North and Stoke Newington going to be allowed to feel that optimism with a Labour candidate of the name Dianne Abbott in this general election or not?
Oh, look, we've had a general election that only the Prime Minister seemed to know about. We are almost complete in our candidate selection.
The problem is, the reason I'm asking, no, you can, because the reason I'm asking is our colleagues at Newsnight have found out that the Labour investigation into whether Dianne Abbott is allowed back into the party was actually completed in December of last year. Months and months ago. You've got 5 days to figure out whether Dianne Abbott, a trailblazer in your party, can come back. It is time to say, is she coming back?
Look, the process we have in the Labour Party is frankly not one that any politician in the Labour Party decides. So I can't give you an answer on that. We want that situation resolved. We all want to see that resolved. What's your opinion? I think that I genuinely don't know the circumstances.
You don't need to know. Do you have an opinion?
I think that in any disciplinary matter, you need both sides to engage in it. I genuinely have no additional information other than that. But we all are keen to see every situation like this resolved as soon as possible.
Just ridiculous. Carrying on the charade. Mike, what did you make of that with Jonathan Reynolds?
Yeah, it's all a mess. I think essentially what's happening here, and let's be absolutely blunt about this, is Labour trying to squeeze Dianne Abbott and people like her out of a party. Right. So the Ford reports revealed that, black MPs, black and Asian MPs, to be on the receiving end of quite horrific abuse by members of the Labour Party. I don't think we've seen anything from the Labour Party suggest they're going to do anything to protect those MPs from this abuse. If anything, what's the Labour Party going to do is try to squeeze these people out of the party, right? And try to recreate the Labour coalition, right? So the Labour coalition will no longer include, strong black women and Asian women who are on the left. In fact, what's going to happen is the lives of these people will be made difficult to the point where they're squeezed out of the party. Now, let's be clear. Dianne Abbott wrote that letter, right? And she shows some contrition for the letter. She's apologised. The letter was wrong. We can move on now. So I think what's happening is these rules of, contrition and, being able to apologise are being applied to the likes of Neil Coyle, who can apologise and be readmitted. With Dianne Abbott, there's no intention whatsoever to readmit her to the party. I think we can be blunt about that at this point, right? Because I think what's happening is Keir Starmer and the party trying to completely wear Dianne Abbott out to the point where she goes, you know what? I'm going to have to run as an independent at this point. I can't do this anymore. To her credit, Dianne Abbott has stood firm and stood strong. But I don't think, I ultimately don't think the Labour Party have any kind of plan to admit her. And what I would say is, this is genuinely disgusting treatment of a woman who has served for nearly 4 decades in Parliament. She's been a Labour MP for 37 years. That is unbelievable dedication to serving her constituents for nearly 4 decades. And I don't think any MP deserves to be treated the way Dianne Abbott has, let alone someone who served for nearly 40 years, right? So this is, for me, completely abhorrent, and it shows that Labour have no interest whatsoever in terms of reinstating Dianne Abbott. They wanted to wear her out completely, drain her of all her power. And we have to remember, Dianne Abbott's been one of the most abused MPs in Parliament. We've seen this in the lead up to general elections. The abuse she received when she was very hyper visible as the Shadow Home Secretary, and Labour are doing nothing to kind of defend her, back her in this circumstance. It just all is a complete mess for me.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary, and it's about to get even more extraordinary because on the subject of Dianne Abbott, we have some breaking news right now as we speak. This is from Stephen Swinford, political editor at the Times. If we can get this up, he has just tweeted this, exclusive with Patrick Maguire, who's at the Sunday Times, of course. Dianne Abbott will not be allowed to stand as a Labour candidate in the general election, bringing an end to her 37-year career in Parliament. There are no circumstances in which she will stand under the Labour banner on July the 4th. It's pretty definitive, and like I say, this is the political editor at the Times. There are no circumstances in which she will stand under the Labour banner on July 4th. Senior aides to Starmer have held discussions about restoring her to Labour whip before election to allow her to leave politics with, quote, dignity. So the disciplinary process ended last year. The plan was to get her back in the tent and then kick her out again. She obviously didn't want to play ball with that. And now she's gone. And this is something actually, Mike, I'll maybe throw this back to you in a moment. This is something I just find utterly extraordinary, that the political class have no understanding of what loyalty is. They do not get it. You see this with the Tories and Boris Johnson, by the way. Boris isn't helping us. He's not good for us. Get rid of him. You see it with Keir Starmer and Jeremy Corbyn. Okay, you've served your purpose, like Toy Story. Goodbye. And now you see it with Dianne Abbott. There is absolutely no concept of loyalty. Now, you might say, that's politics. I think this is taking things to a new level. We've not ever seen this before. This disposability of people in politics for so long, like Corbyn, like Dianne Abbott, utterly extraordinary. And I think it really gets to the heart of how corroded, decayed, and frankly, disgusting and degenerate this country's politics is. And I think, frankly, there is no solution without proportional representation. The two parties are broken, they're reprehensible, they are fertile ground for nothing but immoral, vacuous people, and they have to be gotten rid of, is my view. That's bigger than Dianne Abbott, but it really goes back to something that you heard about Jeremy Corbyn when he was being pushed out in 2016. There was that quote, of course, where they said the Parliamentary Labour Party was trying to break him as a man. Let's be honest, that's precisely what they've tried to do here with Dianne Abbott, this country's first ever black female MP. They've tried to break her. She's not given in. And now this, utterly extraordinary, utterly extraordinary. Keir Starmer happily calls himself a socialist. And he's also open about the government not having as much money as he'd like to fix things. And yet he has a strange relationship to the rich paying more in tax. Here he is speaking to Beth Rigby of Sky News.
You said in that speech it's disrespectful for Sunak to say the economy turned the corner when taxes are higher. But isn't it also disrespectful when you promise people, for example, to raise income tax for the top 5% of earners, and then you ditch that when you get nearer to power? Now, there might be good reasons for that, but doesn't acknowledging that you have broken some of the promises you made go some way to fixing these trust issues that you have?
I think
You've just totally avoided that.
Let me take that head on, because there are a number of pledges I made when I was running for Labour leadership. Most of those are still in place. They're the building blocks of what we've now put in place.
Most of them are still in place. Most of them. Okay, maybe not all of them. Most of them. Complete and utter lies. Now, this is really important because Starmer says that so casually. He's very good at lying, okay? You might be quite good at falling asleep or breathing. It might come naturally. For Keir Starmer, it's lying. Let's look at those 10 pledges from 2020. Let's have a look, because he says he's kept most of them. Let's see. Here are the first 5. There were 10, remember? Number 1, economic justice, income tax on 5% of earners, reverse the Tories' cuts in corporation tax. Number 2, social justice, abolish universal credit, end the Tories' cruel sanctions regime. Climate justice. Number 3, Green New Deal. Number 4, promote peace and human rights, no more illegal wars. Review all UK arms sales, but apparently not. Number 5, common ownership. Public services should be in public hands. He's kept none of those. That's the first 5. Okay, let's see the next 5. Remember, Keir Starmer said he's kept most of these. Number 6, defend migrants' rights. Full voting rights for EU nationals, gone. Defend free movement as we leave the EU, gone. An immigration system based on compassion and dignity, end indefinite detention, and for the closure of centres such as Yarl's Wood. I don't know, are they still saying they'll close Yarl's Wood? I mean, they basically say that James Bond should run immigration enforcement. That's basically what they're saying. Have a interagency operation in terms of border control. Number 7, arguably, you could argue, if you're being generous, they've kept this, right? The New Deal for workers' rights, you could argue. I don't think they have, but you can make that argument. Number 8, radical devolution. A federal system to devolve powers, we've not seen that. Abolish the House of Lords, that ain't happening. Number 9, equality. Pull down obstacles that limit opportunities and talent. We are the party of the Equal Pay Act, sure start. BAME representation. You've just blocked the first woman in this country's political history to stand in Parliament from standing again after 37 years. We're the party of BAME representation. How? With politicians, don't listen to what they say, see what they do. And on this, they're talking crap. Let's go back to that. Again, Starmer says, we've kept most of these. Number 10, effective opposition to the Tories, forensic effective opposition. Look, you could say, well, they're doing well in the polls. Okay, fine. He says, unite our party, promote pluralism, improve our culture. That's definitely not happened. But there is effective opposition in so much as Labour are looking to win. So let's say out of 10, let's be really generous and say 2. I don't think that, by the way. I'd say probably 1, 2 halves. But let's say 2. That's not most of them, Keir. Anyway, let's go back to that clip because that wasn't the end of what he had to say. Here's what Starmer said next.
Some of them have changed. And this is an issue that's important because the reason they've changed is because we can't afford to do them anymore. I said that we should abolish tuition fees. We can't, now the damage has been done to the economy, particularly by Liz Truss.
You could raise taxes.
It is not possible to do that.
You could raise taxes on the top 5%, and you said I don't really want to get into the policies. What I want you to acknowledge is that part of the trust issue is also about things you said as Labour leader.
I totally disagree with you, and I'll tell you for why. I think it's more important to stand in front of the electorate and say, I'm sorry, I can't now afford what I said before because of the damage that's been done to the economy.
Why can't you afford to raise taxes for the top 5% of earners?
Not to simply stick with something which you know you can't afford.
Well, you can afford to raise taxes on higher earners, can't you?
What I'm saying to the electorate is this. I'm going to tell you in advance of the election what I don't think we can afford to do. I'm not going to tell you that you can have everything and then break a promise after the election. I'm going to level with you now. There are some things that we now can't afford because of the damage done to the economy. I think that is basic honesty with the electorate.
Uh-oh. Looks like we need the repairman. Get out the yellow pages. Robo haircut seems to have broken. Maybe it's a software glitch. Maybe, Beth, you can turn him off and turn him back on again. Sometimes that works. It might be the fuse. Now, clearly, this is just a line Starmer will keep repeating, even when, as in this case, it's just utter nonsense. We can't afford to do the things I previously promised, I'm afraid. We can't afford to raise taxes. Money is tight. So I'm afraid we can't just afford to have more money right now. Do you understand how that's incoherent? We can't afford to raise taxes. We can't afford to have more money. He's ready for that line with regards to tuition fees, with regards to welfare reform, getting rid of that two-child cap on benefits. But hey, Keir, I'm not talking about spending money. I'm talking about raising it. No, we can't afford to raise money right now. And did I mention Liz Truss is to blame? Did I mention, by the way, my father was a toolmaker? You can see how incoherent this looks. Now, besides the bizarre political performance that was offered right there, I think that clip demonstrates 2 things. Starmer is happy to lie. We know that. But also, he just doesn't seem very interested in tax increases on the rich. Forget making the case for tax increases. Even when the case is put to him, he starts talking about something completely different. Mike, do you think Keir Starmer opposes higher taxes on the rich?
I don't think he's interested, like you said. I completely agree with you, Aaron. And I think this is all part of remaking the Labour Party, right? So what Keir Starmer has said throughout his time as Labour leader is the Labour Party has changed. And we can quite clearly see that because in my view, one of the kind of key Labour principles for as long as I've known the Labour Party, for as long as I've been politically engaged, has been those with the broadest shoulders pay more. they pay more. That's naturally how it works because they have the ability to pay more. And yet we see the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, saying he can't afford to raise taxes on the richest in this country. It's genuinely bizarre, and it speaks to me of a man who has no interest in raising taxes on the richest. And we know why this is the case, right? For Labour, for the past 2 or 3 years under Keir Starmer, they've been a party of the business, and they're trying to position themselves as a party of the rich, right? That's what the party have been trying to do. They aren't a party of working families as they claim. And because it's inconvenient to tax the rich, maybe they're going to get a bit upset and, be hard on businesses, they're going to get a bit upset. Labour have chosen the easy route here, but actually, no, we don't have any interest in this anymore, and it's about the ideological rewriting of the Labour Party, which is why you squeeze out Dianne Abbott, which is why you try and penalise the left who raise concerns about these issues, because that's not what Labour are about anymore. This is the new Labour. And whenever Starmer says that, we need to take him very, very seriously. The new Labour is one who have no interest in making those with the broadest shoulders pay more. It's a Labour Party that is for businesses, for the rich, and not for working families. And let's be clear, that's what the new Labour is. The new Labour don't stand up against, the slaughter of tens of thousands of people. This is the new Labour, and this is what we need to understand the new Labour to be. This is a party that's completely morally bankrupt and have no interest in fighting for the most vulnerable in society.
Yeah, I think people often, they refer to Blair, but look, Blair had Gordon Brown, right? I mean, Gordon Brown is not left-wing, but he was, he's to the left of Starmer. He had John Prescott. He did some, there were some left-wing policies. I don't see it with Starmer. I'm sorry. I think actually prepared to be even more disappointed than you're ready for. I also want to go back to some of those pledges because, of course, the point made by Beth Rigby there was that you can make money, right, from the first pledge, or they wouldn't cost anything at all. Starmer is, of course, saying we can't afford these pledges, even though I've kept most of them. We know, we've just established he hasn't kept most of them. But let's just go back to those pledges again to look at which ones would cost money. Okay, economic justice, one, which is what he was being questioned about, increasing taxes. That doesn't cost money. Okay, that makes money. You've got two, social justice, that would cost some money, of course. Ending the two-child cap, abolishing universal credit, yeah, that costs money. Climate justice, yeah, costs money. Promote peace and human rights, doesn't cost money. Common ownership, well, I don't think that costs money in the long term, but that's a political disagreement people will have. Defend migrants' rights, doesn't cost money. Strengthen workers' rights and trade unions, doesn't cost money. Radical devolution, that's going to save money, right? Scrapping the House of Lords, or at least significantly reducing it, save hundreds of millions of pounds. Equality, doesn't really cost money. Effective opposition to the Tories doesn't really cost money. So 1, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 don't cost money. I think you'd say 2 of those make money. That's 7 of the pledges, and only 1, 7, has arguably been kept. Maybe you could say 7 and 10. So this idea that the pledges cost money, they don't have to. I mean, I talk about this a lot. We could do so many things which would be progressive, which would save money. Reducing the size of the House of Lords, getting rid of police and crime commissioners, getting rid of all these fake quangos and commissioners. We have a commissioner for victims. I would have thought victims should be looked after by the police and the CPS. What do I know? Apparently we need a permanent commissioner. You could get rid of lots of these people, lots of these jobs, and you could save lots of money. Of course, Starmer isn't talking about that because the whole point of those jobs is creating fake jobs, political sinecures for the permanent political class. The people that fail to become MPs, well, they can be lords, they can be commissioners, they can work for quangos. They can have all the fake jobs around Westminster. And I think actually more than anything else, his inability to articulate an argument to get rid of the fake jobs is what worries me more than anything else. If you say we've got no money, but I'm going to get rid of the fake jobs, I could buy it, but he's not. Anybody that says we can't afford to spend money on X, but is keeping police and crime commissioners who, from what I can see, don't do anything, shouldn't be listened to. That's all from us tonight. Mike, thanks for joining me.
Always a pleasure, Aaron.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. And a privilege to be joined by all of you. We had almost 4,000 watching this evening. It's not Michael Walker numbers, but we're getting there, people. Thanks to all of you for watching tonight. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.